Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Science in Context. Today, we are talking about geoengineering. Recently, we had this episode about permafrost and sea level, and Kevin and I were very sad in it. It was one of our darker episodes. Upon re-listening to it, I was like, "Oh wow, we do sound pretty, pretty down about this whole climate thing."
Yeah,
I
we were
think,
distraught.
yeah, distraught is a good way to put it, for good reason.
Yeah,
It's a dark subject, and it's like this is our future.
yeah,
Yeah. So we figured out we'd talk about like, well, how are we going to fix it? And this isn't really exactly fixing it, though, right, Kevin? There's like some differences here that I will definitely go into later on, but it's like a couple strategies of trying to mitigate the worst effects of climate change.
right. Yeah, it's kind of a band-aid. Geoengineering is what we'll be talking about. It's a way of sort of addressing the symptoms of climate change without addressing the root cause, and that's a really important distinction. Geoengineering doesn't stop climate change from happening. It just helps to kind of reduce how effective it is and how destructive it can be.
Yeah, because we have some limits, like around, say, above 2 degrees Celsius of like an average global temperature, like things will be really bad. So the idea is like if we're getting close to that, maybe we can employ some sort of large scale geoengineering, maybe lower the temperature of the Earth by like a zero point 0.2 degrees Celsius, just to like keep us below like disaster levels of like just heat. But there's other effects too that we'll probably talk about, just like ocean acidification, which
Yep.
is like it's not really something we looked into too much about, like how to reverse, and we don't really have any methods for like helping to fix that, really.
We're going to go into a few different techniques that fall under the geoengineering umbrella. Talk about how they help kind of mitigate climate change and also what maybe some drawbacks are associated with them.
Yeah, so which one are you going to start with, Kevin? We have two methods. We direct air carbon capture. That way we suck down all the CO2 from the air, not all the CO2, some of it, and just do something with it, maybe store it or convert it to something else. Or we have solar geoengineering, where we're going to affect the amount of light or radiation that comes to the Earth.
Right. So we talked about kind of the causes of climate change in an older episode where we mentioned carbon dioxide and other gases effectively trap heat in the atmosphere, while so that kind of falls under the first topic that you mentioned there, and that falls under greenhouse gas removal. So that's kind of one of the two main subtopics in geoengineering. The other being the second thing you mentioned, solar radiation management is kind of the way they just or the title of it, where you're trying to affect how much sunlight or how much radiation hits the earth and ends up being trapped inside our atmosphere and resulting in heating the atmosphere. So why don't we? Oh, it doesn't matter to me which one we start off with.
Okay, let's go into CO2 capture, I guess, just
Okay,
because that's what I'm talking about, I guess,
sure.
and that makes me happy. Uh, I think one of the coolest things that, at least about reading this article, people might have seen recently. It came out over the summer, but it's one of those scientific articles that just happens to get picked up by like all the press. So it's kind of everywhere for a little while. But there's this company, I believe they're in Canada, called Carbon Engineering. You've probably heard of them at some point, Kevin. But basically, what they're doing is to direct air capture of CO2, and then they also do a second step in that process where they turn CO2 into fuels, which is actually a pretty nice uh, use of CO2 because then it's like a kind of closed cycle, right? This would be if they're trying to offset like emissions to something that's dispersed, kind of like cars. Then a way to just kind of to get rid of that CO2 because you can't really capture the CO2 at like the tailpipe of a car would be to try and get rid of some of it from the atmosphere, and then if you convert it into fuels, there's no, like nothing really happened.
Right. So some of the other methods besides using it for something useful is you can kind of pump it into the ground and trap it there so that it's underground instead of up in the atmosphere trapping heat. But obviously, like you said, if you can make it a closed cycle where you're getting rid of it, turning it into something useful, something that's not harmful to the environment, that's a really nice way to not only take it out of the atmosphere, but also get something that you can make a profit out of.
Yeah, lots of actually climate projections that at least people like modeling like what we need to do to lower emissions and get to this like uh we talked about this climate report recently about like by 2040 where we have to kind of be like carbon neutral almost by then. uh, Most of them involve like negative CO2 technologies, where like something like planting lots of trees or like using like processes like these that directly capture a CO2 from the air as like they factor that into the model because they're like we're going to need something that takes CO2 out of the atmosphere and keeps it out.
Right.
So as you said, you can just pump it underground. You can also just turn it into something solid, calcium carbonate, and then also like just put it somewhere. I don't know, put it in a box or something, and just don't heat it up, and you're good.
Is there a use for calcium carbonate? I mean, I guess some calcium supplements might be in that form. Is that, I know it's calcium
uh,
citrate.
yeah, I don't know. There's not too much. So the reason why I brought up calcium carbonate is because carbon engineering in their pretty cool process, they actually use calcium carbonate in a pretty clever way. So I'll just get into how their technology works. It's a liquid system, and what they have is potassium hydroxide solution. And what they do is they have these like big blowers, and they blow air through this aqueous solution of potassium hydroxide. And CO2 reacts with potassium hydroxide to make potassium carbonate. And then this is the sneaky part, I think. At least to me, this is like it really just as a chemical engineer, like this next step really makes everything work. And what they do is they take potassium carbonate and they react it with calcium hydroxide to make calcium carbonate. And then
Okay.
that also remakes potassium hydroxide. Basically, what that does is that we're transferring the CO2 from this potassium carbonate to calcium carbonate. And what calcium carbonate is a solid. So that we just took the CO2, which was in solution, and we precipitated it out and we made the solid. And that way, it's just really easy to separate a solid from a liquid.
Yeah,
And
that's very clever.
yeah, it's really, really smart idea. And so that's how you can store the CO2. So if you wanted to just like get rid of CO2, what you would do is you just take that calcium carbonate, and as I said, you just shove it somewhere probably. Um,
Yeah.
but what they do is they want to use the CO2. So what you can do is just heat up calcium carbonate, and it actually requires a lot of heat. This is one of the downsides of the process, but you can release CO2 if you just heat calcium carbonate, and it'll make calcium oxide and CO2, and it's relatively pure. And that's just how it's such a simple cycle, and that's actually how they just do the whole process. They take that calcium oxide and they treat it a little bit to remake the calcium hydroxide, and it's just these like two cycles that are kind of interconnected. They use to first capture carbon dioxide, then just get the carbon dioxide into just like a pure form. But like it's really cool because there's a lot of like hard problems with this. I mean, we talk about carbon dioxide and like there's so much in the atmosphere. It's really bad, but the actual concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is pretty low. It's in like ppm range. So there's not like a really large driving force. There's not much of the CO2 just around to like be absorbed onto something or for reactions to happen. Usually you want like a high concentration of something.
Right. Right.
So that's like it's just one of the like the fundamental problems of getting rid of CO2.
Yeah, even though it's such a nuisance as far as being a greenhouse gas and it causes all these problems, there's not actually that much of it to be able to just go up and grab and take out of the atmosphere. So yeah, it's a good point. An important step is figuring out how to drive some sort of reaction or some sort of collection of carbon dioxide.
Yeah, one of the great things about this is because it's pretty selective, right? So that's a second problem is like first thing we want it to be fast, and it's hard to be fast when there's not much CO2 around, which this actually is just pretty fast reaction. We also want it to be selective. And so once we have the CO2, we have a few minutes so we can just talk about what we do with it. This is surprisingly simple. Uh, there's an interesting part of the process that they didn't talk about. Actually, one thing I should say before we go forward, it's really amazing what Carbon Engineering did. I don't know if it's because they had government funding and they were forced to do it, or they're just good people, but they published like an entire process diagram with all their like the material balances. They say how much material is going in and out of each part of their plant and all the energy requirements for everything. So there's actually just amazing documentation on what they're doing, which you can find online. I think it's even open access, though I'm not sure about that. But it's just a great thing. So for their CO2 capture plant, you can see everything, which is really cool. But to go from CO2 to fuels, it sounds hard, but it's actually pretty easy. There's this reaction called the water gas shift, And so you can go from either carbon monoxide and water to carbon dioxide and hydrogen, or the either way, basically. And so since they have a pure stream of carbon dioxide, you can add hydrogen to it. You have the right conditions. You can go make carbon monoxide and water, which doesn't sound exciting unless you know what why carbon monoxide is so special. And that's because carbon monoxide and hydrogen, when you mix them together, it's called synthesis gas. And synthesis gas basically can be used to make hydrocarbons of any basically length you want. It's very powerful. It's a Fischer-Tropsch synthesis, but it's essentially you can use it to make fuels, you can use it to make chemicals, and all sorts of things. So it's actually just that's all they have to do. It's just very basic science after that. But the really novel part is that they're doing all this pretty cleanly. They're splitting water to make hydrogen. They're not buying hydrogen. Usually you get hydrogen from methane, but they're completely green in that respect. So that's just like, yeah, yeah.
Sorry, question. So if they're not buying the hydrogen, which obviously saves on costs, then they have to split water, which to my mind sounds like a very energy intensive process. So how does you said it's a fairly green process, but I wonder how much energy is required to perform all this.
Yeah, that is a good point, Kevin. Usually, it really actually, I was looking up, it depends on exactly where you are, but you're right. It's splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen is pretty intensive. It takes like a 1.2 volts to split water, which is pretty high actually. So that is interesting. They don't actually talk about the economics of it in their proposal. I don't know if they get, some sort of credit for being so green. But there actually are places, if like per se the price of natural gas just happens to be high where you are, then this actually can be competitive with the price of splitting water. But yeah, that's a good point. I don't know how feasible it would be without some sort of help from like government, something like that, to help offset the extra cost you get from getting your hydrogen from water, which is expensive.
Yeah. And a lot of these techniques are going to require government subsidies to be viable. I think that was something that they mentioned in that global energy or global climate report that we mentioned in our last episode about permafrost. Yeah, it was in the permafrost episode where we were saying that I don't know if we actually mentioned this during our recording, but the UN climate report said that without governments heavily subsidizing greener energy options, it's going to be very hard to combat climate change. So any one of these topics that we talk about is going to need a little bit of assistance and a little bit of effort on the part of governments and corporations and companies in terms of cleaning up how we produce energy.
Yep. Oh, that's a great point.
We just spent some time talking about greenhouse gas removal, and Mike presented some specific techniques with devices that can capture CO2 and convert them into syngas and other useful fuel type products. So we're going to shift here to solar radiation management, the other major topic under geoengineering. And I kind of want to, there's different ways to do this, including you can even spray seawater into the atmosphere to make clouds brighter so they reflect more light. You can put mirrors on satellites and try to reflect more light, which I wrote down on my notes here, space mirrors with 3 exclamation points. But cool. I'm actually not going to talk very much about that because what I wanted to talk about is this other idea, which is releasing sulfates into the upper atmosphere. So right away, that sounds, yeah, exactly. It sounds pretty scary. Sulfates doesn't sound like the most benign chemical in the world, but this is actually something that's done naturally by volcanoes. When volcanoes erupt, they release sulfates high into the atmosphere. So when we release sulfates into the upper atmosphere, what this does is these are somewhat reflective particles. So it's kind of like the cloud idea, where you have more reflective material up in the atmosphere that's reflecting light away from Earth's surface before it gets into the atmosphere further and heats up Earth. So the problem here, of course, is that if we're putting more sulfates into the atmosphere than would be there naturally, what are some of the downstream effects that might end up occurring? And how much or how little sulfate do we need to release into the atmosphere? And sulfates is going to be the one I talk about most, but it's not by any means the only chemical that we can release into the atmosphere, but it is one that there's a lot of research out there that's being done to determine how viable sulfates are as far as something that we can release as an aerosol into the atmosphere. So just to kind of define what an aerosol is, because I think everybody kind of is familiar with the word, but just to sort of get a picture of it, it's a very small particle that's light enough to sort of be dispersed in the air and not sink back down to Earth from gravity. So they're really, really small particles. You usually think of it like an aerosol can, and what those cans do is they just spray really small particles out of the nozzle. So they're dispersed through the air. So some of the research that I came across when I was looking into this is looking at how sulfates affect human health. So I found a study on sulfates in drinking water, which again, they're going to release the sulfates if they were to do something like this into the upper atmosphere. And so it's hard to model how much of that would long term end up in water and particularly drinking water. But it's still important to know what kind of health impacts it might have in case that were to happen. And it's not as bad as you might think, but this study sounds like a really miserable time for some poor graduate student because essentially what they had to do was collect and measure stool mass from subjects who are exposed to sulfates in their drinking water. Doesn't sound very fun. They were measuring the mass, the frequency, the consistency, and the mouth to anus time.
It's a rough PhD.
That's thank you to that grad student for going through all that. That's not fun. But what they found as far as what the intestinal effects were on sulfates in drinking water is that the only statistically significant measurement was mouth to anus time of stool. That it was much faster when you had a lot of sulfates in the drinking water. So as far as sulfates up in the atmosphere, though, this other paper that I came across that was published in Nature just a couple months ago, actually in July of 2018. It's called Estimating the Global Agricultural Effects of Geoengineering Using Volcanic Eruptions. So essentially what they did is they looked at areas where agriculture is really important, where they're growing crops such as corn or soy or rice, and where there's a volcano nearby that had recently erupted. And what they did is they measured the temperatures, the ambient temperature, and also the crop yield. So the idea with releasing sulfates into the atmosphere, obviously, is that you're reflecting more light and you're not allowing the temperature of Earth to rise as much. And the reason you would want to do this in agricultural areas is that if the temperature rises too high, your crops are going to suffer based on this higher temperature. There's a maximum temperature above which crops are going to start to not perform as well, not grow as well. And so what they found was that there's actually a negative effect of these sulfates being in the atmosphere because what they do is they scatter more sunlight and they prevent that sunlight from then reaching the plants because plants, of course, also need sunlight to grow. So kind of the whole big picture conclusion is that even though you're cooling off the temperature, which is good for the plants, that benefit is offset because you're reducing the amount of radiation that actually reaches the plants. So that's a problem.
Is there any way where we could like try and release it into like, maybe up by the poles, or is it just going to spread everywhere because it's the atmosphere and there's lots of mixing?
That's a really good question. And that is something they're talking about, is that if you target the polar regions, then you can reduce the amount of radiation that hits the polar ice caps and reduce the amount of melting that we're seeing there. And that would be really great for mitigating some climate change because rising sea levels is one of the more devastating and more tangible effects of climate change that we're seeing where coastal regions are going to be very threatened. So that's a really good question.
Also save the permafrost.
Right, exactly. So yeah, I mean, again, there's only so much control you have because if you release something into the atmosphere, it's going to move around. But yeah, if you do release it in polar areas, that's definitely one of the main draws to this type of technology. So another study a couple of years ago on environmental health, they wanted to determine what the health impacts would be more specifically, and not necessarily in drinking water, but in the amount of exposure that would happen. And they actually studied not just sulfates, but a lot of different aerosols that are being discussed as materials that you could release to reflect more light from the upper atmosphere. And so in their abstract, they have these 3 sentences that I want to read that are not real inspiring. They say, adverse health effects can be reasonably expected. Little is known about the toxicity or acceptable exposure limits, and no infrastructure exists that's ready to manage from exposure to any of these chemicals that could be released. So, long story short, they basically say it's not feasible to do right now. there's just too many potential health impacts that could end up doing a lot more harm than good, even though we're trying to mitigate climate change with this technique.
Wow, it's actually crazy how little they know about it, apparently.
Yeah.
Uh, so what's something that came to mind is just like releasing sulfates into the atmosphere. Is there any way that sulfates could uh, form hydro or sulfuric acid with like water in the atmosphere or something like that, or is that just crazy and not going to happen?
I mean, I'm not going to rule it out. I didn't come across that in what I was reading. I wonder if they're because they're releasing it way up high in the atmosphere, like up in the stratosphere. So
Oh
I
yeah.
don't think there's a whole lot of water content up there. Um, but again, if they do migrate down into cloud regions, then you could have potential acid rain effects. So that's a good point as well. Again, there's so many externalities that you have to consider in these types of technologies. And another thing to think about is, say the U.S. releases a bunch of sulfates into the air, and then they move somewhere else, and there's a bunch of acid rain in another country where it ruins a bunch of their crops, and there's a famine, for example, just to put an extreme example out there. Is the U.S. liable for that? Do they have to pay for it? Do they have to help this country out? It's things like that that are going to slow down this process and kind of really, really complicate it as far as who's going to pay for what and how downstream effects are going to be handled. It's a real problem. That's when they say that no infrastructure is ready to manage the fallout. I think that's kind of one of the things that they're thinking about is that we don't really have any way of any prior knowledge or any procedures in place to handle this type of thing. And we don't have any past efforts that we can look at to say, when this happened, this is what we did, because this is really the first time that we're dealing with something like this that's so global and so globally threatening.
But yeah, you mentioned that you could use just seawater. So why don't people try? Is there some downside to using seawater? Because that seems like it would eliminate the health effects that could potentially happen with sulfates if you just aerosolized water instead, because that's pretty benign.
Yeah, I agree. The three techniques that I looked at were the space mirrors that I mentioned, spraying seawater into the atmosphere to make clouds brighter, and the aerosol releases. And so the aerosol releases just sounded the coolest to me, so I kind of don't more than spraying seawater. Just kind of speculating, I would imagine that the more water you put in the atmosphere, the more rain you're going to get. So, I mean, at some point, there's a limit to how much water you can put
Yeah,
up in the atmosphere before it just kind of rains itself out.
that makes sense. You don't want to turn everywhere into Seattle or something like that.
Yeah, but I do think it's. I mean, it's worth trying, right? Just as far as there's already. I mean, it makes the clouds that already exist brighter. So it's. I think that one's definitely worth trying. I don't know what kind of negative health impacts that could have because it's really just salt water in the atmosphere, and the salt's not going to accumulate in any sort of harmful way that I can think of off the top of my head. But I would have to look more into that type of research to really answer that question well.
Okay.
So back to the aerosols. So I talked about how this paper was saying that at some point the aerosols are going to spread and be exposed to humans. But one of the technologies that they're looking at to kind of prolong how long the aerosols stay in the atmosphere is this technique called, well, it's a phenomenon called self-levitation, which sounds like a magic trick, right? But it's what really happens is that these particles that you release, they're so light, they're so small that gravity really doesn't affect them all that much. And so there are other effects that are occurring that are going to make them float in a sense or move upwards. And so the name of one of these effects is photophoresis. And this took me forever to figure out, to like kind of get my head around. I was reading, and there's not a whole lot of information on it that I could find online. So, listeners, if you have more information on this, we could use a real solid explanation. But I'm going to try my best to kind of explain what's going on here. So, it's this process called self-levitation. It sounds like a magic trick, but it's actually this phenomenon that occurs with these aerosols where um, if you picture an aerosol in the atmosphere, just a single particle, you have light shining on one side, and then the other side is dark. So the darker side is going to be a little bit cooler than the lighter side. And so when you have air particles in the stratosphere bouncing off this particle, they're going to bounce off with more energy where the particle is hotter. But what we can do, and this is me sort of speculating because it wasn't real clear to me how the study was performing this. If you have a more thermally conductive layer on the bottom of the particle, on the heavier end of the particle, then that end's going to get hotter. And so if you kind of have the particle so it automatically rotates so that the bottom end is hotter, then there's going to be more energetic collisions on the bottom of that particle, which is then going to push the molecule or the particle higher, even though gravity would be theoretically pulling it downward. You have air molecules bouncing into it on the bottom with more energy pushing it back up. So had any questions on that, Mike? Can I clarify that at all? It's hard to.
Yeah, that's confusing. I wish I could see a picture of that.
Yeah, it's so photophoresis is the name of this phenomenon, and this is indirect photophoresis. And I found a description on Wikipedia, which I think might be incorrect just logically, but I couldn't find much else on this topic, and so that was kind of the way that I sort of understood how they might get these particles to self-levitate. But I don't have a concrete study that I could point you to kind of read up on it.
But this would be the effect that, well, like once we have these aerosols in the upper atmosphere, this is what will keep them there essentially.
Yeah,
exactly. And they won't like fall down mostly.
Right, it keeps them moving upwards rather than falling down into the lower atmosphere and even down back towards Earth. So yeah, it's just a way of keeping them higher up in the atmosphere for a longer period of time. Eventually, I think inevitably they will fall back down towards Earth, but hopefully that this can prolong how long that takes. But the paper does mention it. I mean, this is the same paper that was saying that, or this is not the same paper that was saying it's going to have bad health effects, but it is saying that it's still not feasible because it mentions that the optimal size for these aerosols based on their mathematical models is 1 micrometer, which sounds small, but it's actually way too big for optimal scattering of light. You mentioned earlier how surface area to volume ratio is super important, how if you have a gram of something or a cubic meter of something, you want it to have a huge surface area. So in your case, it's absorbing lots of carbon dioxide. And in my case here, it's scattering a lot of light, a lot of photons of light. So 1 micrometer is actually not really small enough to be really effective in terms of the surface area to volume ratio. But if they could get this to work, again, it's above the stratosphere. So there's a lot less chance of any kind of reactions with ozone or reactions with water or things that might lead to even worse effects in terms of climate change.
That's really cool. I think we're running a bit low on time. Do you have any couple of more points to wrap it up with? Or are we good?
No, I think that's about all I have.
Okay, I guess we're done here then. We can leave.
All right.
Thanks everyone for listening. This has been Science in Context. If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at scienceincontextradio@gmail.com, or you can go to kdvs.org, check under the schedule grid, and if you find our show, Science in Context, Tuesdays at 9 a.m., I have a description of the episode there, and you can find our email there as well. Bye.